What's up, everybody? Hope you're doing all right. Hope you're having a good week and enjoying the warm weather as it's still holding on for us. Unit 13, Lesson 4, or Session 4, one of those words. We're moving on to the book of Second Kings. So we finished the book of First Kings, and we're in the book of Second Kings. And, we've seen some things change since we started the book of Kings. I mean, we've seen Solomon started in First Kings, and he was the king of all of Israel. At this point, they're living in a divided kingdom where there's the kingdom of the north and the kingdom in the south. And so we have the prophet Elisha, not to be confused with the prophet Elijah, but if you have the prophet Elisha, it's his time of ministry, and we see a pretty amazing picture of God's power in this story. So 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 8 through 23. And I want to focus on a couple things here as we talk about, obviously the big meat of the story is this chariots of fire that Elisha sees as his protection against his enemies. But I think there's a couple things we can see that are a little bit more obscure in the text, but have big meanings. I think first you see God's heart for the nations. God is, sometimes we feel like we are God's gift to the rest of the world, and God only focuses on us. And sometimes when we read scripture, we can think about that with Israel, right? And how they're God's chosen people and his favorite people. However, that doesn't mean that God does not care about the well-being of other peoples, right? So you have the Syrians here, and in chapter 5, he gives them a victory, right? And so we kind of see here in chapter 6, the king of Syria is still kind of arrogant. Like he's not necessarily giving thanks to Yahweh. Even though they weren't fighting for God, they weren't fighting for his glory, it was part of God's sovereign plan to give them victory over their enemies. And so, there's a basic principle here of God is a God that cares for the well-being of the nations, so that his plan can be orchestrated, his plan can be fulfilled. And I think that's something we see even in this in the story that we'll talk about here in a minute. But yeah, focus on God's heart for the nations, and how, because God's heart is for the nations, ours should be too. Obviously, the big part of this story is just the power of God's protection over us, right? I mean, for some reason, the king of Syria, every time they try to fight the armies of Israel, they lose, and they figure out their plans. And it's not because they have a leak in they don't have a traitor in their midst. None of that. It's actually Elisha and God granting him the wisdom to know their plans. And so they go to the city of Dothan, however you pronounce that. And they try to capture him and seize him. And Elisha has an assistant with him, and they walk out, and they just see the Syrian army surrounding them. And it's this moment of, what's going to happen? It looks like a hopeless situation. The assistant says, how can we fight such a massive army? And then Elisha prays that God would open up his eyes to see what Elisha is currently seeing. And Elisha is seeing God's army, which are chariots of fire, overlooking and protecting him. And so that if anything were to happen in that moment, God's army would fight against. And so he goes on and he prays that the Syrian army would become blind. And he kind of humiliates them. He actually says, once they become blind, he says, okay, I know the man that you're looking for. Now, the man happened to be him. But he said, I know the man that you're looking for, and I'll take you to him. Takes them on about a 10-mile hike, and they end up in the middle of Samaria. And obviously they're upset and all that. But what's crazy is at the end, they throw them a feast, and they feed their enemy. And the enemy is kind of has this moment of what are we doing? This guy's feeding us, and how can we be angry? And so, but the power of God's protection, what is invisible to us, was very visible to Elisha in that moment. And I think it's a beautiful picture of realizing God's these chariots of fire looking over us, protecting us, going before us. That gives us some boldness, a lot of boldness when it comes to serving him. And then finally, just look at look at God's method of salvation. Sometimes he humiliates people in order to get their attention, because sometimes we're so stubborn that we have to be humiliated, or we have to be brought low. And this Syrian army, I think this was a way that God was able to speak to them and save them, was because, like, man, God got their attention, and how can you not be in awe of what happened, And so just be thinking about that this week as you. I hope you're encouraged by this story too, even as you prepare. Like, let it be a devotion to you, as we're talking about God's power and His supremacy over everything. So, all right. Well, I've gone long enough. So, thank you guys again for what you do, and we'll see you on Sunday.